Loop Studio, and I want to talk about, give some tips for beginners about one of what I think is the most important steps in actually executing the primitive rug hooking stitch, and that is widening the hole of your foundation. And I teach a lot of people, as you can imagine. So one thing that I try to emphasize is when you actually poke your hook down through the foundation material, you really have to give the material a nice yank to widen that hole. And I'm gonna put my finger underneath so you can see how big I'm actually making the hole. See how big it is? So that when I go down and I pull my fabric up, I don't feel any resistance when I'm pulling that up. Now you have to imagine, you're making the hole really, really wide, but the next hole that I'm going into, when I make that motion again, I'm tightening the one behind it. So don't be afraid that you're making your hole too wide. It can really never be too wide, especially when you're using really thick wools, like a number 8 and up. So here are some reasons why you should always widen the hole, and that is really the only energy you're exerting. When you go down, after you pull that monk's cloth to make it wider, you're not using the muscles here and here in your hand. And that's to save your hand. Really, the muscles I'm using are in my finger and my thumb when I'm widening that hole. I'm not feeling pulling on my hand. That's gonna save my wrist from any kind of carpal tunnel in the future. So that's one reason why you always wanna widen the hole so you're not overusing your hands. Another reason you may want to widen your holes, because in primitive rug hooking, we use all sorts of different materials that have texture and that tend to fray. You can see this wool here. It's a little bit thinner. It's got a beautiful texture and a beautiful color, but it does tend to fray a little bit. We shouldn't not use these wools. These wools add a lot of visual texture and actual texture to our rugs, and they're really important in rug hooking to use materials other than just solids. And when you make the hole of your pattern really wide, you're not gonna have a problem with your wool over fraying, because you're not struggling to get the wool through that hole. If I didn't widen the hole, let me see, it's so hard for me not to widen. You can see it's a lot harder for me to pull up when I'm not making that hole big enough. And then it's gonna put unnecessary pressure on my wool, and it's gonna start breaking down because of the friction. So that's another important reason why you should widen your hole when you're using fabrics or textured fabrics. Another reason is if I want to use something such as bulky roving. Look how thick this is. If I just plunk my hook down, it's so hard to get that up. And then my roving is gonna end up fraying and really not working. But when I widen that hole, I bring it up no problem. So it's so hard for me to even poke my hook down and not make that motion. It's just part of my muscle memory at this point. So another thing that happens when you don't widen the hole, when you don't go down and stretch out that hole, let me see if I can do it. See how hard it is to come up. You're fighting with this wool, and what happens is a lot of times is your previous loops start to shrink because you're pulling so hard on the loop you're working with to get that up that you're shrinking the work you've already done, because it's so you're exerting so much energy. But again, if I go in, widen that hole, I'm not gonna have any problem with shrinking loops because I'm not fighting with it, okay? So that's just, again, my philosophy on rug hooking, and one thing I've found to make it technically a lot easier. Remember, widen that hole, stretch it out. That's where you're exerting your energy. You're not fighting with your wool strips to try to get them up through the pattern. So that's just a little tip I know. So thanks again for watching. This is Haley Perry of Loop by Loop Studio. Thanks.